Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Cipher, and this is the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. Welcome back. I want to talk just a little bit about capitalism and socialism, and start specifically with what draws people into these ideologies. Now, people are incredibly complex, and it's dangerous to try to dichotomize people into ideologies, much as we've done with our politics in America, and we've seen how it leads in many ways to radicalization. We've seen this as well in a lot of European countries which have a more diverse party system than just the dichotomy of Democrats and Republicans, but, and I know they're not a true dichotomy because there are other parties we can vote for, but we can talk about that in another video. Anyway, it's becoming the same way in European countries, where there will only be one or two parties worth watching, one on the left and one on the right. And basically everyone knows that voting for any of the other parties is just throwing away their vote. Other than the fact that in certain circumstances in European Parliament, enough votes can get a few members of Parliament in, even if the party loses. It's complicated. However, it's becoming more dichotomized, and as a result, it's radicalizing people in much the same way that we're seeing in America. I think the information age has taken problems that were once localized and started spreading them worldwide. Now, it does the same thing with solutions. This just means that in some ways the world is becoming more alike each other. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it can lead to cooperation and communication, but it can also, in many ways, lead to a breakdown. Back to the topic at hand, though. I think, sorry about the rant about not dichotomizing now that I'm about to, but I think that people can be split into two or three main groups when it comes to what draws them to a political ideology. This doesn't necessarily mean that they'll end up deeply in that ideology, and it's just a unfair generalization. But I certainly think that on a statistical level it holds true. And I've done some research into the matter recently. I think that socialists are people who are drawn to protection from authority, and capitalists are people, so I'll start the other way. Capitalists are people who find individual authority and agency to be one of the most important things. So personal freedom or freedoms for the people. Socialists, on the other hand, believe that there is more protection to be had by giving a lot of those powers and freedoms over to the state for the sake of what they see as security. So there are people who prefer to be protected by authority, and there are people who prefer to have their own individual responsibility. Neither of these is necessarily at fault on any fundamental level. And I personally think that we need to cooperate with each other and find middle ground. But I think this is why we see such a divide back through the ages and popping up again in this day and age between capitalists and socialists, because they're two groups of people who think in fundamentally different ways. Maybe because of genetics, maybe because they were raised that way. for whatever reason, people are different. Now, I grew up watching a lot of George Carlin, and I think a lot of my individualist spirit comes from him. He believed very firmly in keeping our personal freedoms, and saw things like metal detectors at the airport as steps against this. I'm all for metal detectors at the airports and other places. However, I definitely think things can be taken too far when we start giving more and more authority to the government. And I know, I tied authoritarianism to socialism, but, capitalist systems can be authoritarian as well. And yes, they can. But I don't think that capitalists within authoritarian systems are seeking that authoritarianism, unless perhaps they're simply power-hungry and at the top, which is what many people would argue of Donald Trump. Socialists, I think, are actively seeking that protection from authority in a way that capitalist authoritarians are not, and I think this is why, at least in my opinion, and frankly, in the opinions of anyone who's looked at the statistics, there are more authoritarian socialists than authoritarian capitalists. I don't think that that should be too controversial of a view. So, what's the solution? Well, personally, I, of course, lean towards capitalism for a number of reasons. One of the biggest ones is that socialism, every time it's been tried for any real length of time on any grand scale, has failed. I've talked to a lot of socialists, and not one of them has been able to come up with a non-fictional example of a functioning socialist society. And they come up with all kinds of excuses as to why this is, but really a lot of the excuses they come up with are things that would and could have held back capitalist systems in much the same way, but didn't. So, I think, personally, that people who seek out their individualism and their individual freedom tend to be more diverse in their ideas and their strengths and weaknesses than people who seek a common authority to take care of those things for them. I think that this is why capitalism has worked better, even though socialism certainly has merits, and that, well, personally I think a mix of sorts is to be desired. What I mean by that is that humans work best, in fact most animals work best, cooperatively, and humans' ability to cooperate with each other beyond that which animals normally can, mainly due to our due to our ability to communicate with each other more than other animals can, has led us to great things. You can argue that humans are bad for the planet, and in many ways we are. But it's inarguable that we've had amazing accomplishments, that science could even fix the problems that we've created. We've done it before. We can do it again. So, I think that you'll find that socialists, or people who seek authoritarian protection, tend to have a lot more in common, be a lot more similar, and in many ways thus cooperate a lot easier, which is a good thing on the cooperation side. But they lack the diversity of backgrounds and skill sets that leads to breakthroughs in the capitalist system. they're generally too narrow-minded or narrow-fielded in many different ways. So the answer is actually quite obvious. In fact, it's right in front of us here in America. What we need is what we have, just reformed. A social, democratic republic with, of course,